Good afternoon, teachers. Good afternoon, everybody, or good morning or good evening, depending on where you're joining us from. Hello, welcome to today's webinar. I'm so glad to have you guys here sharing with us. Please write in the chat where you're sharing this session from. Where are you? What city, what country, what time is it by you? What levels do you teach? Tell us all about yourselves. Introduce yourselves in the chat, please, so we can get to know each other. Welcome, welcome, Maria de Los Angeles. Welcome. Hello to everybody. I'm right now in Quito, Ecuador, so it's very cold here today. So I have a scarf. I have a scarf on, even though we're on the equator, we're in the mountains, so it's quite cold today. Hello to Kevin from Asunción, Paraguay. Thank you for joining us, Kevin. Nice to see you. Hello, Catherine. Nice to see you from Chiclayo. Hello, guys. Everyone's joining us. That's great. Hello, Lourdes from Iquitos. Nice to see you. Thank you for coming. Okay. So we're going to get started with today's topic. As you guys probably know, we announced on the Facebook page a little while back that we were receiving questions from you. Since this is February and we celebrate Valentine's Day in a lot of parts of the world, Valentine's Day is a day to celebrate friendship and love. And so we thought it would be great to dedicate this month's webinar to you guys and to your questions and what you wanted to know. So I received a lot of questions from many countries. I was excited to read through all of your questions. Unfortunately, we don't have time to answer all of the questions in today's webinar, but we did select some of them that were either quite common or ones that we had heard before from other people. So we're going to address some of those questions today. So thank you, those of you who are still joining. Hello, Sandra. Hello, Janet. Hello, Santi. Nice to see you as well. Okay, so let's get started. Like I said, today we're going to be answering the questions that you guys sent in to RELO Andes. Before we start with your questions, I'd like to start off with a quote that is one of my favorite quotes about teaching. I have a lot, but this is one of them. And this one specifically is appropriate for this month's webinar topic because, as you can see, it says the most valuable resource that teachers have is each other. Without collaboration, our growth is limited to our own perspectives. I think this is a great motto for us teachers to adapt for ourselves, right? We can learn so much from each other. And it's really important that we share experiences, that we share knowledge, that we share what we've learned in the profession throughout our years of teaching, right? Even when we might have gone to the same university and studied the same classes and studied the same programs, we still have different unique things to bring to the table. I know every time I do a webinar with all of you, I learn from you. I learn from your comments. I learn from the Zoom sessions. And this is very enriching for all of us as professionals. So I encourage you to continue to collaborate with your colleagues and to grow together in the profession. Okay, let's start with the first question. So this question was from Matilde. And Matilde asked, what are the common elements between L1 and L2 acquisition? Now, for those who are not familiar with the abbreviations, L1 refers to first language, right? What would be considered our native language. And L2 refers to the second language. When we talk about language acquisition, we always say it is the L2, the second language, even though it's important to mention that when we talk about foreign language and second language in different social contexts, this is different. Right? In other words, if we are teaching, for example, English in Ecuador or in Peru or in Bolivia or in Chile, Argentina, Paraguay, wherever, this is English as a foreign language, correct? Because it's not a language of the country, an official language of the country. However, when we're talking about language acquisition specifically, we use the term L2 for second language, okay? So that has to be clear so that we can refer to these terms throughout the session today. Okay. As we go through these questions, I also invite you teachers to please share your responses in the chat, because I know some of you have a background in language acquisition and have your own experiences in teaching, and I would love to read some of your comments. So please feel free to share your responses to your colleagues' questions also in the chat. I wanted to put this chart here that we have on the slide that very generally describes the differences between learning and acquisition, okay? These are two different cognitive processes. With a first language, we're referring to a process of acquisition. This is a process that happens naturally. You are in the environment of a language, right? And you naturally acquire the language. All of us are born into a linguistic environment, right? If we're born in Bolivia, we might be born into Spanish, a Spanish-speaking environment, or an indigenous language, right? Or something. Okay, in that case, we come equipped with all of the necessary tools right up here in our brains to acquire language. So all we need to do is be exposed to the language, sit back and relax and let the natural process happen, right? Acquisition also involves a natural order. Yeah, what do we mean by that? That there is a natural order in which people start to produce certain structures in their language. For example, in the case of English, I don't know if any of you know, but if any of you know, please write it in the chat. What is the first verb form, let's say tense form, that native speakers of English acquire? What is the first form that native speakers of English acquire? I'll let you think about this question while I look at Santi's comment here. In the L1, children get the language from parents and people around them. L2 is learned in classrooms or other environments. Yes, that's true, right? So we're dealing with natural versus somewhat artificial environment. Okay, good. Okay, so what is the first form that native English speakers acquire in their language? If I go to the United States or Canada or England or New Zealand or Australia, what form do I hear little children producing first? Okay, Eliberto says the present, which would be my guess, right? That would be a natural guess. But actually, the first form that native English speakers acquire is the present continuous. Good guess, Patricia, simple present. That was my guess too. But it's actually the present continuous. Yes, Kevin, the ing. Sometimes they don't use it with the auxiliary, the copular verb be, right? They don't use it with be all the time. They might say daddy's sleeping, but they acquire the ing, the continuous form first. What form do we usually teach in our classes first? What form do we usually teach in our classes first? Besides the verb to be, right? We know that, but besides the verb to be, what form do you teach in your classes, teachers? What is the first verb tense you teach in your classes? I think all of you will say simple present, right? Except native speakers acquire the present continuous first. So right there, we have a problem. We have a difference between what people naturally do in the L1 and how we're teaching the L2. I would love to see someone write a textbook that is based on the order of acquisition of native speakers of English, right? In fact, the simple present form, which is the form that we often teach first in our English classes, is acquired very late in the process of acquisition. Sometimes children up until the age of 4 years old, native speakers of English still don't acquire that form correctly. In the third person singular S, right, that our students have a difficult time remembering and everything, that's a late acquired morpheme in native speakers. So that's interesting. Yeah, it's interesting to think about. So there are some differences between L1 and L2 acquisition. L2 acquisition is not usually 24/7 in the environment where the language is spoken, right? What we can do is try to create environments in our classrooms where our students are more apt to participate in a process of acquisition than learning, because in the end, learning, the end result of learning is knowledge, right? And the end result of acquisition is an ability. And what is that ability? To communicate in English, right? To communicate in English, yes. So obviously the classroom is more of an artificial environment, and we usually have a process of learning and not acquisition, but we can do things in the classroom to make it more apt for acquisition, like giving our students comprehensible input, real language, contextualized language, all that stuff, right? Yes, thank you all of you who are responding to the questions. I see a question here from Adnan. What is the possible order we should follow teaching the forms? That's awesome. That's a good question. If you want to know the answer to that question, I don't have the whole order memorized exactly, but you can Google or look on artificial intelligence, natural order of acquisition native English speakers. And it will tell you the order in which the forms are usually acquired by native speakers. So if you want to make a change in your teaching and follow that order, go right ahead. That's awesome. Go ahead. That would be a great thing to do for your class. But I don't have the order memorized from start to finish. But you can Google that and it will tell you. Okay? Okay. Moving on to the next question. This one is from Santiago. Santiago says, what happens to those little ones that have interference or pronunciation problems in their native tongue? Are they going to carry the same interference or communication issues to an L2? Thank you, Santiago, for your question. Okay, first we have to ask ourselves, what is the source of the pronunciation difficulties? If the source is from something physiological, like they cannot make their tongue or their mouth, lips, whatever, move in the correct way to produce a sound, then we're talking about something we might want to work with a speech therapist with, right? I remember my little brother was in speech therapy when he was younger, like 3 years old, because he could not produce the R sound in English. Instead of R, he said the L sound. So instead of saying run, he would say lun. And this was a physiological problem. So speech therapy was able to help him to move his muscles, to train him to produce the sound that he wanted to produce, right? So if that's the source of the pronunciation difficulties, we have speech therapists that can work with that. But we need to clarify a term here, which is interference, right? What is interference? Interference refers to the influence of the L1 on the L2. And we can have a lot of different types of interference, right? We can have phonetic interference, phonological interference, morphosyntactic grammar, right? Interference, semantic interference with those false friends, we call them, false cognates. We can have pragmatic interference, where it is appropriate to say something in my culture, but not in an English-speaking culture, for example. All of those levels of interference we can have, but interference only occurs when we have influence of the first language on the second language, right? Pronunciation specifically is a physical skill. So because it's a physical skill, meaning I need to train my muscles to produce certain sounds and things, I can practice it. And I can drill pronunciation, because normally we say in language teaching, no, drills are bad. Drills are repetitious and they're not communication. Yes, that's true, right? But drilling pronunciation is different because it's a physical skill and you need to develop what we call muscle memory. What do we mean by muscle memory? We mean the connection in our brains to how our muscles feel when producing a specific sound. Okay, so teachers, what is a sound that is difficult for your students to produce in English? What is a sound that is difficult for your students to produce in English? Think about it. What sound is hard for them? Here in Ecuador, I was going to say exactly what Amélie says, which is the TH sound. I've noticed that Ecuadorians, when they're learning English, have a difficult time with the interdental sound, that's TH, like this, right? So how do we get them to really be able to produce that sound when it doesn't exist in their dialect of Spanish, right? We have to get them to practice and try again and get them to feel how it feels. And at the beginning, it feels strange because your mouth never moved like that before. But they have to establish that connection between the feeling and their brain, remembering how that feels so that the next time they can produce it in the correct way, right? A lot of you are mentioning the TH sound. I see you, the TH voiceless sound. Yes, absolutely, right? Okay, so that's a tip on pronunciation. I remember when I was learning Spanish and I had a teacher who was trying to teach us to produce this difficult sound in Spanish for English speakers, which is the double R sound, right? The multiple vibrant sound. In other words, like that, from rosa, right? And it was so hard for us, but our teacher made us practice and feel how it is. And some of us could not do it. It was impossible. We were spitting all over each other, but we kept practicing, and many of us got it. So it's really important to actually go through that physical skill of practicing producing the sound, right? So that they can be accustomed to how it works. Okay. I see a question in the chat from Mahmoud right now, which is actually what I'm about to address. They say, do psychological disorders have any relation with the language interference in the process of L2 learning? So psycholinguistic disorders, and here we're talking about something like dyslexia, right, which is a disorder involving reading, dysgraphia, which is a disorder involving writing, aphasia, which is a disorder involving language production, like speaking, yeah, etc., are most often apparent in the L2 as well. In other words, if your students are native Arabic speakers or native Spanish speakers or whatever, and they are dyslexic in their native language, more often than not, they're going to be dyslexic also in their L2. Yeah, this is something that's inherent. There have been very few cases where that isn't the case. In other words, their L2 is not affected, only their L1, but this is very rare. This is not usually the case, right? So that's what we can say about pronunciation. Okay. Yes, let's continue. From Luis, a question from Luis. And Luis says, for EFL learners with no level of English, how long does it take to get from A1 to C2 level? Thank you, Luis, for this very common question. And not only English teachers ask this question, people who are learning foreign languages also ask this question. How long will it take me to get to C2 level? Okay. Miracles can happen, but in language acquisition, this is a very long process, right? And there are a lot of factors that influence, that produce differences in L2 acquisition rates. Some of these factors, not all of them, are listed here on the screen. So we have motivation. Motivation is a big factor, and we'll talk about motivation also a little later. If you are not motivated to learn the language because you don't think it's useful, or you whatever, you're not going to be very successful at learning / acquiring the language, right? So your motivation needs to be there. Whatever your motivation is, I want to travel abroad, I want to study abroad, I want to play video games and chat in English, I want to watch anime in English, whatever. It doesn't matter what your motivation is, but you need some motivation to advance in the language, right? Aptitude is something that people have talked about before, but recent studies on language acquisition say that aptitude is not that big of a factor. Aptitude refers to how good you are at learning languages, right? Maybe you've thought, I'm good at learning languages. But if we look at it from a native speaker's perspective, when little kids learn languages, everybody learns approximately at the same rate. Right? Nobody is really better than anyone else because language acquisition is an innate faculty that we have as humans. So maybe we shouldn't talk so much about aptitude. Aptitude is not such an important factor as we once thought, right? And a huge factor right here is the third one, exposure to comprehensible input. If you are not consistently exposed to comprehensible input in the language, you will not acquire the language. And that's period, right? Period. Full stop. So in that sense, what we really need to acquire the language is comprehensible input. Yeah. And a lot of times in language learning situations, this is exactly what students aren't getting. Students are not getting that comprehensible input that they absolutely need for language acquisition. Students do not need explicit grammar rules to acquire language. Students do not need to fill in blanks of verb conjugations to acquire language. No. The only thing that students need to acquire language is comprehensible input, and the proof is in your first language. You received comprehensible input in your first language, and you acquired it perfectly as native speakers, right? So this is a huge factor, very, very important. And like I mentioned a couple minutes ago, language acquisition is a very long and complex process. So to respond directly to Luis's question, I cannot give a time frame because it depends on a lot of factors that come into play at the same time, right? It is impossible, absolutely impossible to go from A1 to C2 in 6 months, even in a year, even in 2 years. It is impossible, humanly impossible to do that. Yeah, because language acquisition doesn't work that way. Now, I can teach you explicitly all of the verb forms from A1, A2, B1, B2, C1, C2, and teach you all of the vocabulary, and we can have, 20 hours of English a week. But does that mean that you are performing at C2 level? Absolutely not. So be careful of those institutes, those language schools that promise you will go from A1 to C2 level in 9 months. It is not possible. Your brain cannot do that. It's as simple as that. You can have all the information, but that doesn't mean you've acquired C2 level in the language, right? So that's something to keep in mind. Okay. Here is also a very common question, and I think maybe you teachers have also dealt with this in your classrooms, so please, please share with us in the chat your strategies to overcome this. Gabby asks us the question, why don't students want to speak? Why don't students want to speak? This is also a complex question that can be influenced by many factors, but from the research, it seems that the most important factor here is the extreme anxiety that speaking in English causes our students. Put yourselves back in your grade school or your high school when you were a student of English. All of you teachers at some point were students of English too, right? Okay. Since you're students of English, you probably remember what it felt like in the beginning when your teacher would say, okay, speak, say something. Tell me a sentence using this verb. The stress, right? Even if you like English, even if English is so much fun for you, they're mortified to speak the language. Exactly. I agree with what Santi says. They are afraid of making mistakes. Absolutely. They are afraid of their classmates laughing at them, right? Especially in certain ages. When the kids are 5 and 6 years old, they don't care. Language is fun, right? But when kids are like 12, 13, 14, the peer pressure and all of those, it's a lot, right? So this is a main reason that students don't want to speak, yeah? Okay, I like the comment that Araceli just made also in the chat here. Students often avoid speaking in English due to a combination of psychological factors, like fear of making mistakes, low confidence, anxiety, and a lack of motivation. Exactly. Alongside linguistic challenges such as limited vocabulary, poor pronunciation, etc., which can make them feel uncomfortable. This is absolutely the case. The fear of judgment, everything. We have to take something important into consideration that I think a lot of us teachers are not, which is this idea of a silent period. So in first language acquisition, we obviously have a silent period. I'm sure that you have interacted with little children in your native language that are maybe about 1 years old, 1 to 1.5 years old. At 1 years old, usually children start to produce their first word in their native language, right? But they can understand so much more than they can produce. What are they doing during this period? It's a silent period for language acquisition where they're receiving input and they're taking statistics on the linguistic data that they receive. So they're hearing all this around them. They're hearing how the sounds sound. They're seeing how words fit together, what combinations of sounds are permissible in our language, what are not permissible, all of that stuff. And they're subconsciously taking statistics on the language. And so they take all that information, yeah, okay. And then they start little by little to produce the language, yeah? What happens in our L2 classrooms is that we force students to speak a lot of times way before they are even close to being ready, really early. And that's our error as teachers, because what they need to do first is build what we call an implicit linguistic system. They need to construct something in here first before they can produce something meaningful from here, if that makes sense, right? So that's super important. There's a pressure to make students produce. I know parents also in your institutions, I'm sure that you've had parents that says, why can't my kids speak English? My kids should be speaking fluent English by now. It doesn't work that way, right? It does not work that way. So what we really need to focus on is giving them enough real language, comprehensible input. And then when they are ready, to have them produce the language, right? To have them speak. And obviously the way we correct errors, we have to be very careful with, because if we are the typical teacher that says, no, you can't say it that way, that's wrong. You think that student is going to want to open their mouth again? No, right? So we have to be careful. Now, I have a suggestion. If you have a class of students that are capable of speaking, right, that can express themselves in English, but don't want to for whatever reason. And I'm thinking of a situation in high school. Students who maybe are 16, 17 years old, they have a B1-ish level. They can have a simple conversation in English, sure, but they don't want to. The whole class is just quiet. Nobody talks. What can we do with that class? There's a very quick game that will create empathy for you as the teacher, okay? You put students into pairs, yeah? Everybody has their partner. One of the people in the partnership is person A. The other one is person B. It doesn't matter who's who because they are going to do the same things, okay? So then you say, okay, someone is person A, someone is person B. Person A, okay, for 1 minute, you're going to speak to person B. It can be in their native language too, if you want, in their native language or in English. You're going to speak to person B. Person B, you cannot say anything. You cannot move. You cannot anything, nothing. You are like a statue, okay? And then you look at your time. You go 1 minute, ready, go. And person A speaks and person B is like this. Nothing. I mean, nothing. Not a sound, not a movement, not a gesture, nothing, okay? Then 1 minute is finished. Switch. Now person B speaks for a minute and person A is like a statue, like this. Okay. When you finish the second minute, right, you tell them, how did you feel when you were speaking to your partner for that minute? And the students will tell you, teacher, it was awful. It was horrible. It's like they didn't care. They weren't even listening to me. I felt so stupid. I felt so bad talking. I felt so, okay, you felt horrible, right? Yes, it was horrible, teacher. Why? Okay. Then you say, okay, take that feeling, multiply it by 60 minutes because you spoke 1 minute, right? In this class is 60 minutes. And multiply that one person that you spoke to by 30, 25, 40. How many are in your class? And that's the sensation that I feel when I don't have collaboration in the classroom. I promise you that something inside of the students is going to change. And this is very good because it creates empathy, right? So it makes them realize what it's like to be in your position. And normally, the students will, from then on, become more collaborative. But I only suggest that you use this if the students are already capable of really expressing themselves in English. Otherwise, it's a lot of pressure for them. Yeah? Okay. Yes. Thank you for all of your comments that you guys are making in the chat. Thank you, Mamad, for the comment. The first and main goal of my language teaching journey is to prepare my students psychologically and then make them efficient communicators to be proficient speakers. Yes, this is important. The psychological part that Mamad mentions here is extremely important, and we're going to get to that in a bit. Okay. Manuela asks, what's more important when learning a new language, vocabulary or grammar? And here I would like to say neither and both at the same time, right? But if we break it down, we see that vocabulary contains lexical information. It's really the meaning of language, right? So if I have some vocabulary in English, I can put the vocabulary together in a way that makes myself understood. Whereas grammar is a tool for expression. So I'll tell you a quick anecdote. When I was 21 years old, I spent a year studying in Paris. And that year I traveled to Italy for a week as just a vacation, right? And I didn't know Italian. And so there were some Italians who wanted to talk to me and my friend that I was there with, right? But neither of us knew Italian. So I was trying to speak Spanish, but they were like, So we bought a dictionary, an Italian dictionary, a pocket dictionary, and we just used the dictionary to communicate. Did we know grammar in Italian? Absolutely not, right? But we got our ideas across because we had the vocabulary, the meaning of the language, okay? So it's very important to have vocabulary because those are ideas we want to express. I can say, for example, want coffee. You can understand that I'm saying I want coffee. Is it perfect English? No, but I express the idea, yeah? Grammar helps us to refine that idea. How important is correcting errors in students' production? This brings us to this question about grammar and vocabulary. In a communicative approach, which is what we should use to teach, we value comprehension over accuracy, fluency over accuracy. In other words, if a speaker, a student, whatever, can express their message, then we're getting somewhere. Because what is communication? It's exchanging ideas, right? So if I can understand what the student says, that's progress. Of course, that doesn't mean grammatical anarchy, anything you want, no. And we need grammar, especially to communicate more effectively and in more formal registers, right? But that comes, it comes, just like little kids. A little kid could say, "Mommy, milk." She understands that he wants milk, right? He doesn't have the grammar yet, but he got the idea across, right? So that's something to consider. Okay. This question from Fernando. Recent research is questioning the belief that the best age to learn a second or foreign language is at a very early age. What do English teachers need to know about this issue? Thank you, Fernando, for your very valuable question. So let's start about raising a child bilingual. Maybe some of you are parents or would like to be parents, and you're considering raising your child bilingual with your native language and English. Research shows that the most effective way to raise a child bilingual from birth is one parent, one language. So for example, I live here in Ecuador, right? My native language is English, but Spanish is the language spoken in Ecuador. So I speak to my son in English, only in English. His father speaks to him only in Spanish. And the language of the household should be the non-dominant language of society. In other words, if I'm interacting with his father, I should speak in English also, right? Because my son has Spanish outside of the house, in his school, etc. Yeah. So this is if you want to raise a child bilingual. We also should mention the sensitive or critical period for L1 and L2 acquisition. We used to call it the critical period, but now we call it the sensitive period because it's not that it's absolutely critical. It can happen at a little after this period, right? But it is a period where children are more apt for learning languages, for acquiring languages, let's say. In L1 acquisition, it's before the age of 5. Yeah. And in L2 acquisition, it's before the beginning of puberty. So if we can start with a foreign language before the beginning of puberty, we have more chance that the students will reach a native-like proficiency in the language. Okay, there's no guarantee, but there's more of a chance that that will happen. Yeah, that does not mean that after a certain age you can't learn language anymore. No, because the language acquisition device, the LAD, right, which is a notion by Noam Chomsky, famous linguist, it never stops working during our lifetime. I know people who live here in Ecuador, retired North American people who speak English, who have learned, actually acquired Quechua, which is the one of the indigenous languages spoken here in Ecuador, the most spoken, right? It's Ecuador's version of Quechua, yeah? They have acquired the language just by living in the communities, and they're 70 years old. So it's possible, right? It's possible throughout our lifetime, but it seems that it's good to start around 7 or 8 years old. Why? Because by then, the children already have a good grasp on how their native language works, and they can now continue with other languages. So this is probably the best age, it seems. But again, you know, there's also flexibility. There's always exceptions. Thank you also, guys, for your comments. Vilma and Araceli in the chat. Thank you for your comments, for sharing your thoughts on this issue as well. Okay, briefly. Gabriela asks, what is the correct order to acquire language? Speaking and then listening, or listening then speaking, or reading then speaking, or what, right? So what we're actually talking about here is the skills of the language, which is not exactly the same as acquiring the language. Acquisition is natural. How do we acquire our first language? By listening, right? We get all of our linguistic data from listening, at least the first years of our lives until we start to read. So it makes sense that we need to be exposed to a lot of oral data. But in the students' cases, we can also have written data in the language because now they can actually read, right? Skill development, in other words, developing, speaking, listening, reading, and writing, is separate from the development of the implicit linguistic system. In other words, acquiring English as a foreign language is different than learning how to write in English. It's a separate skill set, yeah? So one thing is building your implicit linguistic system through input, and another is developing the skills in English, yeah? And we have to remember that our comprehension is always greater than our production, even in our native language, because we can understand more things than we can produce. And this is totally normal and totally natural, right? So students will understand more than they can actually speak or write in the language. Okay. Tanya asks us the question, how do affective factors like motivation and anxiety impact language learning? Thank you, Tanya, for this question. So this is dealing with something we call the affective filter, which is not only in language learning, it's also in learning other subjects, physics, math, et cetera, right? So it's this wall that goes up in your brain when you have negative feelings towards, this case, English. And it doesn't allow good input to penetrate it, yeah? So if we have a low affective filter, this is a good thing. Our job as teachers is to provide good quality input and also lower students' affective filters. Yeah, we have to make sure that they do not feel anxiety, that they're not stressed, that they feel some type of motivation in our classroom, that they're comfortable. There are webinars on lowering the affective filter and also providing good input. Lowering the affective filter is from April of 2024. So you can go back on this RELO Andy's Facebook page and take a look at some strategies to lower those affective filters. And in May, there's a webinar that was about providing comprehensible input to our students, how to give good input. So I invite you, if you didn't watch those, you can go back on the page under videos and find the ones from April and from May of last year, and you will get some practical tips on how to work with these things in the classroom. Okay. How can student autonomy be encouraged in language learning? This is a question from Jaime. Thank you for this very important question, because we're talking a lot about being autonomous these days, right? The first thing we can do is give students more freedom with the language. Let them discover English through things they are already interested in. Yeah? But be sure to ensure they are working with language that is at or slightly above their level. Because sometimes if we give students, green light to do whatever they want, they might be working with English that's way too above their level. So we have to kind of guide it a little bit, right? We can also use something called guided self-selected reading, which is very popular now for language teaching, which is where we have a series of books, usually children's readers, simple readers, for students to choose from. Which one is the most interesting to you? You can read this book because it's at your level, right? So this is another way. I remember my Spanish teacher, when I was 12 years old, told us to watch 1 hour of Spanish television per week. I don't know if that was the best idea, because some people would watch shows that weren't appropriate and some would watch telenovelas and things like that. But it gave us freedom with the language to explore Spanish ourselves, right? So this is what I encourage you to do. Instead of giving them traditional homework, fill in the blanks, worksheets, boring, right? Give them the opportunity to explore English through things that they like. You like anime? Go watch an episode in English. You like to learn how to cook? Go find a YouTube video in English that teaches you how to make a recipe, whatever. But give them that freedom. They're going to obviously gain autonomy, and they will also enjoy the subject more, right? Okay. These are a lot of questions for so little time, but moving right along. Karina asks, should I avoid using the L1 in the classroom? If so, how? Especially with beginning learners, this is difficult. Okay. Before we used to think, like at the beginning of this century, that we should only use the L2 in the classroom. That's it, no L1. But now we've reconsidered this, and we say, actually, strategic use of the L1 is beneficial in the classroom. And we can use a technique that's called translanguaging, right? Even the name sounds cool. Translanguaging is the idea that you go between the L1 and the L2, but not translating everything, just in strategic moments, just very strategically, to build the students' interlanguage, which is the bridge between the L1 and the L2. Yeah. So for example, if there's something that's very difficult for your students, like in English, the difference between the simple past and the past continuous. I ate, I was eating, right? And your students are just like, I can't understand the difference. I can't get it. It doesn't make sense. Okay. You can switch to their L1 for a moment. And since in the region, most of us are native Spanish speakers, you can switch to Spanish and just say, okay, vean. Lo mismo sucede en español, right? And you can tell them. Like, for example, we have, ayer comí una hamburguesa, right? O ayer estaba comiendo cuando mi mamá llegó, yeah? So we have like this contrast there. And then they say, oh, yeah. Oh, wait, we do that in Spanish too. That's it. Then the light bulb goes on in their heads and they say, oh, okay, that makes sense. Suficiente, we continue in English, right? We just do it once for like 30 seconds to help them to make that connection. And they say, oh, wow, got it. And then we move on. Yeah. We don't want to use too much translation to reduce negative transfer. In other words, to reduce errors caused by the first language. And we don't want them to depend on the L1 to produce the L2. They can't be translating in their heads all the time to speak in English, because this is cognitively exhausting. So we don't want to use too much translation, but some translation is okay. Okay. Paulina says, is it effective to read stories in English to toddlers or babies to acquire the language? Why and what do I have to consider? reading is an outstanding tool for language acquisition. Yeah. In the case of babies, we know from research that babies need human interaction to begin acquiring a language. We can't give them a recording, put them in front of the television. That does not work for language acquisition. They need that social connection with a human. Reading books is an excellent way to do this. Children's stories are effective tools for L2 acquisition for any age. In fact, even adults are encouraged to read children's stories. Why? Because children's stories are written in simplified language. They are situations that people can understand. There are illustrations that help, right? So all of these make reading a really good source of input for acquisition. Of course, what should we consider? Consider the topics you choose, that they're appropriate for the children, right? The pace of the reading, we have to read slowly so that they can process the language. We have to consider visuals. We should also allow them to look at pictures with the story and things like this. This is what we need to look at. Okay, one last question here. As you can see, I didn't have time to include all of them, but this question is from Michelle, and I think this is a very common question in the region of the Andes. I know I hear this all the time in Ecuador. How can I deal with lack of resources like energy, materials, screens, computers, internet, etc., right? How do we deal with this? Okay, we have lots of other resources. Some of us went to elementary school before the internet, before we had computers in the classroom, right? How were we taught? We used posters, realia, magazines, newspapers, photocopies, songs, blackboards, whiteboards, everything that we have, right? All the resources that we do have. During the pandemic, we learned how to utilize WhatsApp. In Ecuador, in the public school system, many of the students do not have internet connectivity in their homes. So they did not have virtual classes. How did their teachers teach? They would send these like documents via WhatsApp, and then they would do exchanges via WhatsApp with the students, right? Where they would have links, they would send images, audios, etc. Be creative with WhatsApp. There are a lot of videos and articles about teaching with WhatsApp since the pandemic. So I encourage you to take a look at those because they will give you great ideas. Have students design posters, bring in items, for example, fruits and vegetables vocabulary. When I was a student of Spanish when I was 14, my Spanish teacher assigned each of us a fruit or vegetable to come the next day to class and teach our fellow students. So everyone had their own creative idea. Let the students come up with creative ideas. I remember I had the fruit las fresas, and my dad was a percussionist. He was a musician. So we had maracas in the basement. So I took the maracas, I made a picture of a strawberry, I stuck the strawberry to the maracas, and I invented a song about las fresas to the music of La Cucaracha. So I sang the song and I shook the maracas, and that's how I taught my classmates las fresas, right? So there are a lot of different ideas that we have. Yes, some of you are sharing in the chat. I agree, Santi, that teachers are very creative. Araceli says we need to create our own material. Absolutely, we need to be creative. That's one of our strengths. So we need to do that, right? Please go ahead and share also other techniques you have used when you don't have the internet or computers in your classroom. Okay, we've come to the end of this month's webinar. Unfortunately, I could not answer all of the questions, but maybe in the future we will address some of them, perhaps. So I thank you to all of you who submitted your questions to this session. I really appreciate it. I hope that this has been beneficial for you. And I would like to finish with this quote that is from Helen Keller, where she says, "Alone we can do so little, together we can do so much." So just like at the beginning of the session today, I encourage all of you to interact with your colleagues, to teach each other, to learn from each other, and above all, to be teachable. A good teacher never stops learning. We are all teachable. I know this much about language teaching. And the more that I learn, the more I realize I have so much to learn. So we have to be humble in this process and be open and willing to share but also to learn from each other. I think this is really important. Don't forget to join us on the Zoom session in 10 minutes if you can. I'd love to speak more directly with you guys. We can continue the conversation. Thank you so much, as usual, for joining these sessions, and we will see each other again soon. Goodbye, teachers. Take care.